In the 1950s, in Richmond, Virginia, a nursing student named Emma Felder started every shift the same way. The uniform was heavily starched cotton, stiff enough to crackle when she moved, with a white cap pinned in place. The kind of cap nursing schools designed uniquely to their own institution, so that anyone passing in the hallway could tell exactly where a nurse had trained, just by looking at her head. A small watch hung upside down on her chest, pinned there the way every nurse of the era wore one, so she could read a patient's pulse without ever taking her eyes off the room. Hers marked her as a student at Hampton University. Her training took her past the Medical College of Virginia Hospital almost daily, a large, well-kept building with everything her own hospital didn't have. The one where she actually worked, just down the road, was small and overcrowded, 30 or 40 patients packed into a single unit, with barely enough staff to keep up. Felder never forgot that walk. It wasn't an exception to her training. It was the entire shape of it. That gap between what black nurses were given and what they were expected to do with it anyway runs through almost every part of this story. We're counting down 10 things every black nurse navigated in the 1950s. Some of it was written into law. Some of it was a choice individual hospitals and organizations made on their own, with no statute requiring it either way. And some of it was never written down anywhere at all. Not a law, not a policy, just something everyone in the room already understood. The first 5 are about the institutions. The last 5 are about what it actually felt like to live inside those institutions once the rules stopped being written down at all. Stick around for number 1, because by then the policy had already changed years before the building ever caught up. Number 10. The 2 hospitals. Felder's memory of Richmond wasn't unusual. It was the rule, not the exception. Across the segregated South, nearly every city that ran a hospital for white patients also ran a second, dramatically smaller and poorer one for black patients, staffed almost entirely by black nurses doing the bulk of the day-to-day care themselves. Across these underfunded hospitals, sheets were boiled and reused until they wore through. Bandages were rationed by the inch. Where the white hospital down the road had rows of proper beds and room between them, the black hospital often lined cots straight into the hallway once the wards filled past capacity, which they did most weeks. The buildings told the story before anyone said a word. What made it sting more is that this wasn't hidden or shocking enough to provoke outrage in most of white America. It was simply how healthcare worked, openly, for decades. The disparity in funding wasn't a side effect of segregation. It was one of its primary tools. That gap in resources showed up in outcomes, not just inventory. Patients arrived sicker because they'd already been turned away somewhere else first. Infant and maternal mortality rates in black communities ran well above what the same level of care, properly funded, could have delivered. And yet those threadbare hospitals were often the only places black nurses could train at all, which meant the very system designed to limit them also became the place where an entire generation of black nursing talent was built, almost in spite of itself. Number 9. The quota that started a fight. By the time World War II reached its final stretch, the US Army was desperate for nurses. Army Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk stood in front of an emergency recruitment meeting of 300 people in New York City and floated the idea of drafting nurses outright to fill the gap. In the room was Mabel Keaton Staupers, Executive Secretary of the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. She had spent years watching the Army accept black nurses only under a strict ceiling, just 56 positions at one point, while the Navy refused to take any at all. So when Kirk suggested a draft, Staupers stood up in front of the entire room and turned his own argument back on him. If nurses were needed that badly, why weren't the trained, qualified black nurses already waiting to serve being used? It was a risk that could have ended her career on the spot, and she took it anyway. What made that risk worth taking becomes clear once you know what those 56 nurses had actually been asked to do once they got in. They lived in segregated barracks marked colored, worked in segregated hospital wings, ate at separate tables in separate dining halls, and many of them weren't assigned to wounded American soldiers at all. They were sent to staff hospitals built for German prisoners of war, men who had mostly arrived in good health after the trip across the Atlantic and needed little medical attention to begin with. It was an insult stacked on top of an insult. Qualified black nurses, finally allowed to serve their own country, were handed the least demanding assignment available, while American soldiers went short-staffed elsewhere. Some of those nurses found the surrounding treatment of the prisoners harder to take than the assignment itself. Small-town residents and army officers were often friendlier toward the men they were detaining than they ever were toward the nurses treating them. By 1944, with all of that still in place, only 300 black women were serving in the entire Army Nurse Corps against roughly 40,000 white nurses, even as thousands of qualified black women had applied and been turned away. That's what Staupers was standing on when she challenged Kirk. Months later, in January 1945, the Army opened its nurse corps to qualified nurses regardless of race, with no quota attached. The quota wasn't some old, faded rule by then. It was something actively defended right up until someone with enough standing refused to let the math go unchallenged. Number 8. A church basement, 53 women, and no permission asked. None of that fight was possible without an earlier one most people have never heard of. In 1908, a nurse named Martha Minerva Franklin, working out of Connecticut, had grown tired of watching black nurses get systematically excluded from professional nursing organizations that claimed to represent everyone. So she organized a meeting, not in a hotel ballroom or a hospital boardroom, but in the basement of St. Mark's Methodist Church in Harlem. 53 black nurses found seats wherever they could in a room that wasn't built for meetings, folding chairs, a low ceiling, the kind of space a church lends out because no one else will rent you one. They weren't asking the existing nursing associations for permission or for a seat at an already set table. They built their own table entirely, right there in that basement. The National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses, created specifically because the official one wouldn't have them. For the next several decades, the NACGN would be the only organized professional voice black nurses had in the country. Mabel Staupers didn't invent the fight she led in front of Surgeon General Kirk. She inherited it from 53 women who met in a church basement decades earlier and decided that if no one would let them in, they'd build the entire structure themselves. If an organization like that existed by 1908, you might assume the worst of the formal barriers were already falling. They weren't. Rule 7 is the law that proves it. Number 7, the law that told you which door to use. Some of this didn't have to be guessed at, because it was written into law in black and white. A Mississippi statute from 1917 required every hospital in the state to maintain separate entrances for white and black patients and visitors, with each entrance to be used strictly by the race it was assigned to. Versions of this practice persisted in hospitals for decades afterwards, shaping which door a black nurse, patient, or visitor was expected to walk through well into the 1950s and beyond. The sign itself was rarely subtle, stenciled straight onto brick in some buildings, a simple painted placard nailed beside the doorframe in others. Mississippi wasn't unique in this. Versions of the same statute existed across the segregated South. For a black nurse walking into work every morning, the door had already been decided for her, a specific door reserved for a specific race before she was even born. Number 6, the hospital that turned no one away. Not every institution in this story is one of exclusion. In 1891, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams founded Provident Hospital in Chicago, the first hospital in America to be both owned and operated by black professionals. By the time black nurses were training there decades later, Provident had built a reputation that quietly worked against everything the rest of the system stood for. It accepted all patients, regardless of race, and regardless of whether they could pay. There was no waiting room sorted by race inside Provident, no separate registration desk for who you were before anyone asked what was wrong with you. Just one door, one line, one nurse checking you in. For many black families in Chicago, that single unsorted doorway wasn't a backup option. It was the only one that didn't have a sign on it telling them to go somewhere else. Working there meant practicing real, full-scope medicine on every kind of case that came in, without the artificial restrictions other hospitals placed on what a black nurse was allowed to handle. If you're finding this useful, like and subscribe before we get into the second half. The next 5 rules are where it gets harder to explain, because none of them was ever written down anywhere at all. That's the institutional half of the list, the starched uniform crackling under hospital lights that never had enough budget behind them, the stenciled sign deciding your door before you ever arrived, the folding chairs in a church basement that built an entire organization out of nothing, the one hospital door that didn't ask who you were first. Everything from here is different. Nobody filed paperwork for what's coming next. Nobody had to. Number 5, nobody had to say it out loud. If you'd walked onto a hospital ward in 1955, no one would have handed you a memo telling you which patients were yours to treat. You'd have simply known, the same way everyone else on that floor already knew, without a single person ever having explained it to you out loud. There was no chart pinned to a corridor wall sorting patients by race, no memo taped above the nurse's station. Physicians simply knew which patients to send where, and black doctors weren't extended privileges at white hospitals regardless of what any rulebook said. A law can be repealed in a single afternoon by a legislature or a court. A shared unspoken understanding across an entire profession has no single document to strike down. It has to be unlearned, person by person, hospital by hospital. For a black nurse, that meant operating inside two sets of rules simultaneously. The ones written into policy manuals, and the much larger invisible set everyone around her simply already knew. Navigating both at once, every single shift, was its own form of professional skill, one that never appeared on a transcript or a certification, but without which the job was simply impossible to do. Staupers built her standing in that fight in public, in a room of 300 people, with the army's own top doctor watching. What she did with that standing once the room emptied is a different story entirely. Number 4. The meeting no one publicized. Some of the most important work in this story happened far away from any hospital floor. In 1944, Mabel Staupers secured a meeting with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to lay out exactly what black nurses were facing, both the ones being turned away and the small number already serving under restrictions designed to limit how far they could go. That kind of access wasn't handed out casually. Staupers had spent a decade building NHEN's reputation, case file by case file, into something credible enough that the country's most visible woman would sit down and listen to it. The meeting didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. There's no single document that proves a direct line from that meeting to the policy change that followed. That's how this kind of advocacy usually works. Quietly, in rooms with no press present, building leverage that only becomes visible once the policy it was aimed at finally gives way. Months later, the restrictions came down. Number 3. The first one doesn't get a bad day. Every black nurse who crossed into a previously all-white hospital unit or military post understood something never written into any policy. She wasn't just doing her own job. She was auditioning, indefinitely, on behalf of everyone who might come after her. Her charting got checked twice as often. Her uniform got inspected a beat longer than anyone else's in the room. This is a documented pattern across nearly every field that desegregated piece by piece in this era. True for the first black flight attendants hired into a previously all-white industry. True here too. A single mistake could be picked up as proof that the old exclusion was justified. A single moment of excellence barely registered as anything beyond what was already expected. There was no point at which she could simply be an average nurse having an average day. Being first wasn't an honor with breathing room. It was a performance requirement nobody officially asked for, and nobody ever let up on. If that's what it took just to hold the job, here's what it looked like when people finally stopped performing along with the system at all. Number 2. The system cracking from the inside. By 1960, the walls were already starting to come down in places nobody had announced. At a hospital in Jackson, Mississippi, a complaint was filed alleging that nurses had quietly started assigning white nurses to the hospital's colored floors and black nurses to the white floors. The elevator operators, all of them black, had simply stopped enforcing the unwritten rule keeping black and white visitors from riding together. They just kept pressing the buttons, floor after floor, and nobody stopped them. State investigators sent to look into the complaint found segregation there, in their own words, on the verge of collapse. Nobody had passed a new law. No court order had arrived yet. The system was wearing thin from the inside, years before any law caught up to formalize what was already happening on the ground. Number 1. Winning the policy wasn't winning the building. By 1948, black nurses had full membership in the American Nurses Association. By 1951, NACGN had accomplished exactly what it set out to do in that Harlem church basement and dissolved itself. Mission complete. That same year, Mabel Staupers stood at the NAACP's annual ceremony and was handed the Spingarn Medal, a small, solid object that said officially, the fight was won. The door with the sign on it was still standing exactly where it had always been. Separate entrances, wards, and entirely separate hospitals kept operating for almost 15 more years, largely untouched by the medal or the membership rolls or any of it, until federal Medicare funding requirements in the mid-1960s finally forced the physical integration that policy alone had failed to deliver. A whole generation of these nurses lived their entire careers inside that gap, holding, in a sense, both things at once, a profession that had opened on paper and a building that hadn't. So looking back across all 10, which of these was actually law, which was institutional choice, and which was never written anywhere at all? The stenciled sign on the hospital door and the 56-nurse ceiling on the Army Nurse Corps, those were law, plain and enforceable, changeable by a legislature or the stroke of a general's pen in a single session. The one hospital door that didn't ask who you were first. The folding chairs in a church basement that built a professional organization from nothing. The funding gap that meant boiled sheets and cots lined into hallways. Those were institutional choices, made by people, reversible by people, but never required by any single statute. And the rest, the chart that was never pinned to the corridor wall, the uniform inspected one beat too long, the elevator buttons in Jackson that just kept getting pressed regardless of who was on board. was never written down anywhere at all. 3 different kinds of barrier. 3 completely different ways to take them down. A law needs a legislature. An institution needs new leadership or new funding. An unwritten understanding just needs enough people, in enough rooms, to stop going along with it. Which is, in its own way, the hardest fix of the 3, because there's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it ended. Emma Felder kept walking that same path in Richmond for the length of her training, past the well-kept building she couldn't work in, into the crowded one she could, her starched uniform crackling the same way every morning regardless of which door she used. Decades later, on record describing exactly what she'd seen, the policies that should have closed that gap were already years old on paper. The buildings just hadn't caught up yet. That's the real through line here. The church basement in Harlem. The confrontation with a surgeon general. Black nurses were handed Nazi prisoners to care for instead of their own countrymen. The hospital in Jackson quietly falling apart from the inside. None of it changed because someone asked nicely. It changed because women who were never supposed to have the standing to challenge any of it, built that standing anyway. One organization, one meeting, one refusal to back down at a time. A policy is written in a single afternoon. The building it's supposed to govern takes decades to catch up. Someone has to go on living inside that gap while it closes. The same gap existed for the black teachers running segregated classrooms a few miles from these same hospitals. What they navigated, and how it was different, is next.